I think, an overall sense of people being aware that almost every media house is to some extent or the other compromised.
The media in South Africa is facing enormous financial pressure. Can the industry survive? I posed this question to Kanthan Pillay in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full discussion with Kanthan Pillay, that's linked in the description below. Enjoy. And do you think the Afrikaans media is perhaps more durable and robust because that's the primary way in which you as an Afrikaans speaker would be able to get access to information, whereas English language sources are more abundant?
I think that the Afrikaans media landscape is probably one of the more resilient in this country. And again, it's simply because that you've had an asset stripping in terms of state resources around the Afrikaans medium in general. So, Radio Sonder Grens is still one of the places at SABC that functions reasonably well. But if you look in terms of the amount of money that has been poured into Afrikaans programming on TV, that to a large extent has shifted gear. And so you've seen a fall off of those audiences going to, the likes of CakeNet and so forth. The print publications have been reasonably solid over the years as well, but they too have seen an overall decline in terms of their readership. And again, that's not surprising, because if you consider the ownership structures of basically every media house right now is in some way beholden to some faction of government. And, I've touched upon this a couple of times before, but certainly e-media has a history of being very clearly aligned with the Ramaphosa faction, which, goes back to the fact that Johnny Copeland was in his own capacity, Johnny Copeland being the chairman of the board of the chief executive of the holding company and chairman of the board of e-media, was one of the single biggest donators to the Ramaphosa campaign. You've got SABC obviously is very firmly in terms of state hands. You've got Naspers is the chief executive of Naspers, used to be chief executive of Cyril Ramaphosa's Shanduka. You have the group that's now printing the Sunday Times. Certainly they have Jabu Moleketi's team across out there. If you look at DSTV, the chief executive of MultiChoice Africa is Gwede Mantashe's son-in-law. So across the board, you've been seeing I think an overall sense of people being aware that almost every media house is to some extent or the other compromised. And you see this manifest itself in terms of the way in which Adrian Basson, who runs News 24, is, so firmly up Cyril Ramaphosa's posterior. It's actually quite embarrassing most of the time. So I don't know where the Afrikaans audiences have actually been moving to get additional sources of information. But at the same time, take into account the fact that we have had an overall depletion in the size of the Afrikaans population in this country, based on the fact that there's significant numbers that have been migrating to other parts of the world. And, I think by and large, the language ends up being a kind of casualty of that process, because, if you move to the United States, you're unlikely to be spending significant chunks of time communicating in your mother tongue. I mean, certainly the only time I get to speak Tamil is with my mother these days, because, certainly no one else in my family does.
So what about the issues of credibility of media institutions, particularly the so-called legacy media? I mean, I remember during the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, there was that scene of that journalist standing before a burning building saying that these were
the mostly peaceful protests.
Peaceful but fiery protests, yeah.
Yes.
So, and I think most people just would have looked at that and been incredulous about why should I believe what this commentator is saying. So, I mean, that's something that's happening across the board. Even BBC, which you mentioned earlier, which was almost like a broadcaster of record, if you will, and had a global reach. You know, I think if you had to cast your eyes over the website of the BBC World these days, you'd get a pretty clear sense of their political leanings. So, you know, can we blame audiences for seeking alternatives when the media houses themselves are sacrificing their own credibility?
No, I think you've answered your own question. You can't blame those audiences. But you see, the interesting thing is that by and large, people know when they are being lied to, and more importantly, they will also then vote with their feet in terms of where they end up watching. I mean, you consider, you know, Joe Rogan as a phenomenon, you know, just single-handedly, where he's pulling audiences of about 11 million people per podcast, versus CNN, you know, pulling something like less than 1 million now for its primetime bulletins. You're talking about 800,000 people who are now tuning in. So I think that that crisis of credibility has led to an overall decline in audience. And one would have thought that there would actually be a sea change that would take place, where people would realize that, well, what we need to do perhaps is to actually reverse direction. But you know, clearly the vested interests that now have a role to play in terms of these media operations are really difficult to overcome. So, you know, a very good example of this is that Fox News, as a case in point, has massive reach. I mean, it's still the biggest primetime news broadcast in the United States. And in fact, Fox News pulls in a larger audience than all of the other players put together. So you put in CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, all of them, and Fox News is bigger than all of them. But there are people who will advertise on those other channels who will not advertise on Fox News. And they will not advertise on Fox News because they're afraid of cancel culture. Because and so you get into the self-reinforcing trap where you're not able to get the advertisers on board, where you could then make the money to give to produce a better product, and it's going to be and that's why I like coming back to the newspaper analogy, because you can't stop the individual from putting down their money to actually ensure that the subscription keeps flowing.
Thanks for watching. Please do leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Also, if you would like to check out the full discussion with Kanthan Pillay, that's linked over here. And you can also subscribe to my other channel, that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.